Percent of the time, I have no idea what I'm talking about.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, it's not. It
Gets the people going.
You are now listening to Diagnonsense
Then we would just be idiots saying nonsense.
with Kurt Honak
Damn it.
and Isaac Smolden.
I am also here. I've got my book. You've got your chocolate. I've got our notes. Very detailed notes. Is there anything worse than people that think that they sound smart or like think that they know what they're talking about?
Pretentious.
Oh yeah, no.
That's hard. That's hard to beat.
I mean, I don't think, like, how long do you think people are going to make it into this? Like 5 minutes once we actually start talking about what we're talking about?
That's why I want to get an outline going.
That's why you're putting an outline down. Because I do have a minor in history, not a big deal. But that almost feeds into the pretentiousness because it's not even like I majored in it. It's like I just.
I think when we talk about this, we have to keep a couple things in mind. We have a Western centric perspective on this, and it would be really easy to be offensive to somebody who is coming at it from an Asiatic sort of perspective. And this author is a Western author too.
Correct.
So we need to keep that in mind.
It is
just
that is
just
true.
for the sake of not dignity but tact.
Counterpoint, you sound pretty communist, Kurt.
Well, but that doesn't mean we can't draw parallels between our opioid epidemic and our government's response to it. And,
Oh yeah. No, I think we can draw a lot of counterpoints.
And that doesn't mean that we can't talk about the fact that there was a demand there. It wasn't just the Western powers came in and destroyed the dignity of the culture. It's like, well, it was already prevalent. People were using it before they started importing it at the volume that they did. But
the
that
good
certainly
news
didn't help.
is that this podcast isn't going to make it past the CCP firewall anyway.
No, none of this will.
So they won't know how much they disagree with us. You know what I mean? Well, I guess we shouldn't keep beating around the bush.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone to Diagnonsense. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm Isaac Smolden, and I'm joined by Kurt Honak. How you doing, Kurt?
I'm doing good. It's busy. Spring is here.
You're wearing your Diablo 4 shirt.
I am wearing
Spring
my
is
Diablo
here,
4 shirt.
And you're wearing your Diablo 4 shirt.
Excited for Diablo 4.
Okay, so let's just get into it. Obviously, and by it I do mean housekeeping. The biggest housekeeping thing is that Justin isn't here because he is stepping away. Justin's stepping away from the podcast, and we wish him all the best in everything that he's doing, which is a decent amount. Definitely going to keep you updated on the new Nuisance stuff that's coming out because it's a lot, and I've heard it, and it's really good. Justin sent me over some stuff. It's really good stuff, the best stuff that him and Mike have been putting out, I think. So be on the lookout for that. For now, Kurt and I we're gonna take the reins and we're gonna move forward with our subject today. You know, we do a lot of movie reviews on here, and we decided we would educate you guys. We're with some highbrow entertainment. We're doing a book club review.
I don't know about
we
educate.
read books, everyone.
I don't know if we're educating anybody. It was educative for me. Or educating. Yeah, educating.
We're already falling off. The wheels are already falling off the wagon.
The wheels already coming off.
So it's the book that we read. Well, okay, so Kurt read it first, and I ordered it on Amazon.
So the deal is that I was going through I feel like we miss a lot of things from history. And one of the things I found a profound amount of information about the social structure of mental health care from reading like Thomas Sowell. Well, Thomas Sowell doesn't necessarily write. I mean, he does write about the modern mental health care system, but he ties a lot of that into the history of Europe and really the religious strife that's happened there over centuries and the policies and the things that ultimately led up to the Protestant Reformation and the founding of the United States, and kind of highlights how it's bizarre because, you know, we've really been over a lot of the social issues that we have in history before, and we seem to repeat a lot of mistakes. And so I guess I was thinking with the opioid epidemic, I was looking up opioids one day. I happened to be on like Wikipedia or
Like
something,
every
right?
day?
No,
This
no,
is where
not
Kurt gets
every
all of
day.
his information from.
Not
is
every
Wikipedia.
day, but no, I was like on
Just
Wikipedia.
typing into Wikipedia, how do I take down Big Pharma?
No,
Big Pharma
no.
secret weakness.
No, I think it was, I don't know. It was for opioid policy or something. And I was looking at the Opium Wars and I was like, so you're telling me there was a war over opium?
It's actually
Like,
2 of them.
yeah, right. And so I
Spoiler.
started looking into that one day. I think it was actually for a college paper now that I remember. But
Smart guy.
I was
big smart guy with the college paper.
I was looking at that just going, oh my God, like how can, because opioids are derivative of, they're like a synthetic version of opium, right? Or they've been synthesized differently so that they're stronger than the opium counterpart, right? The natural plant that's been cultivated for
A long time. I think in the
forever.
book they reference like the 1400s or something
Yeah.
as the first written accounting of people using opium, and like
Yeah.
I'm gonna throw air quotes around the use of the word medical.
Yeah.
But
Well, they say
it
in
was
there
medical.
that
like
it was being smoked in the 1700s in China, right?
Oh, yeah.
That they had been, I think it was first, I don't know, there's footnotes in there. I don't know if it was imported by the Turks or I can't remember who imported it. And so they had been recreationally using it in Chinese culture. And I'm not an expert in like Asiatic history or anything like that. So this was all new to me, right?
Now we
Like,
are. Now that we've read this book, now we are qualified to talk about
well, I
all
don't
of
know,
Asiatic
but
history.
It's from a Western perspective. Julia Lovell is a British historian. The way I approach things now, like with the mental health care industry, because that's what it is to me, is that it's kind of like he said, she said, in terms of what actually happens with the history. And now with the science, they're talking about ghost written papers and things where authors for papers don't even have access to the research that they've published, which is bizarre because the way the pharmaceutical industry works. So I kind of just approached everything with not a grain of salt, but just with a lot of healthy skepticism, right? So
The name of the book is The Opium War, and like you said, it is by Julia Lovell.
Yeah.
It is definitely like the sort of book that your professor assigns you in a history class, but like one of the ones where you're like, oh, that was actually like pretty good. It's a solid 340 odd pages, but it's like $20 on Amazon for the paperback copy because I bought it to read, and then I ended up, because our flight from Juneau, Michelle and I's flight from Juneau got delayed so long, I had like 8 hours on the plane to just totally finish the book,
Wonderful.
which I did. If you're a nerd like Kurt and myself, then you'll probably really enjoy it. If you're not, then we'll just try to go through it and sum it up for you. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. So obviously about opioids and an opioid epidemic from back in the day. But there's also a lot of stuff about the degradation of a society, the fall of an empire. There's lots of parallels to modern day wars and politics. And it's, even though the author obviously is coming at it from a Western perspective, she definitely does her research. In fact, I think in the conclusion of the book, she talks about going to China multiple times and talking to high school students and teachers and people coming from all these different perspectives. There's also maybe one of the most interesting things in here to me is how different cultures and different people view the objectivity of history, and that there's a base level of like, this is what actually happened. But then depending on who you are, where you come from, what your background is, and in some cases what the Chinese Communist government is telling you, you'll have a vastly different perspective, because there are definitely a lot of very immoral things that the British, in this case for the most part, do to the Chinese in kind of this overarching story of 60 years of off and on war, with the legal sale of opium being kind of a driving factor. But then there's also, and we'll get into it, there's a lot of kind of self-reflection from Chinese philosophers and leaders about how they are solely responsible. There's a lot of like not self-hatred, but self-blame for allowing the Western powers to do this to their society, and now the reason why this has become a big topic is because the Opium Wars are kind of seen as the death of the Chinese empires and I think it's the Qing dynasty, right? I'm going to butcher so many Chinese pronunciations, but I think the Q is
from
the CH,
from my
right?
translation that I read in there. I believe that's how it's
Pushes glasses up. Yes.
glasses.
The Qing dynasty and kind of the start of the roots of the modern day Chinese Communist Party. And obviously there's a lot of finger pointing at the West, not all of it undeserved, because the British kind of they kind of bullied their way through China. And it's wild because over and over again you see like, oh, here's 100 British soldiers going up against an army of 5,000 Chinese soldiers, but when half the army is addicted to opium and actively smoking opium in a war zone, and the rest don't have any cohesive leadership. It's like, oh,
I mean, that speaks
so that
to,
happens.
well, there's a few different things, you know, in one of my classes, one of my favorite terms, and let me back up a little bit and just say that looks like the most comprehensive history on the subject that I could find when I was trying to do my research. Because what I try to do is pick out a really defining book or like a magnum opus of an author or a genre, so that I can get the lowdown on the entire subject, because I just don't have time to in-depth research. So hopefully I won't slaughter any of the things in here in terms of of what people commonly believe or anything. I just, I'm a lay person that I'm trying to understand why the opioid epidemic is happening in the United States, and historically, what does that look like in different countries? And this just seemed like a really profound history on it. From the perspective of the book, I think there's a few things going on. And one of the things that I've learned in college is one of my favorite terms, and I forget which, I think it was cultural anthropology, that I learned the term biocultural and how biology can influence culture and vice versa. And I thought some of the things that I see happening in the United States, I feel like are in impact from policies being pushed because we're trying to adapt to the opioid epidemic, whether it be in culture or in politics or whatever, right? I mean, I think there's a few things that led up to the conditions of the British War. I think Julia Lovell covers it pretty well in there when she talks about, yes, there was rampant opioid use, not just from the military, but the aristocracies. It kind of trickled down from the aristocracies and the rich and the leaders into everyday workers. And there's some of the other conditions maybe are, not everybody had access to medicine. They're coming out of kind of a feudal age where not everybody has access to medicine, and it hasn't been sort of refined to the point where it's widely accessible for people learning it and people teaching it, or it hasn't been universally sort of assimilated like that.
Well, and the idea of medicine varied wildly between the Western and Eastern cultures at this point as well.
Yeah.
With kind of both perspectives having different stuff that worked and was revolutionary, and different stuff that was just like not even close to being accurate information or effective remedies. This is still pre-Crimean War when the first Opium War breaks out. And that, the Civil War, the Crimean War, that's where really a lot of these medical advancements come from, is that process, and then coming out on the other side of it. So
you'll have to remind me, Isaac, Crimean War is what time period? I'm not history.
That was 1860s, I believe,
1860s,
or maybe late 1500s, right around the time of the U.S. Civil War, and that was fought over in the Crimean region, obviously, between Turkey, England, Russia, and I think France also was possibly a part of it.
And
I don't know. Don't take my history minor away, please. Please. I worked really hard on it when I was taking nothing but online classes and basically stumbled into a minor.
Yeah,
history.
but in these periods, we're really starting to see more of a transition from theological medicine being practiced to more of a secular approach and material sciences approach to medicine. And so not only, I don't know, I read it and I feel like I have a lot more sympathy for where the Chinese people are at today, because they had kind of this empire and they're trying to like keep it under control with how many people. The Qing dynasty is trying to keep it under control, and their technologies kind of comparatively, they're just at odds, because the British have their naval fleet is advanced for the
pretty
time.
good.
Yeah, for the time.
It's part of the song, right? Like, Hail Britannia, Britannia rules. They made a whole, it's a banger. They made a whole song about it.
But they've got advanced weaponry. They've got the naval dominance, and tragically, I feel like the Qing Empire tries to hold on to their monopoly of the opium trade, because one of the things that I saw in this too, that because I was trying to figure out, okay, how did they respond to opium? Because right now we are in an opium epidemic, or opioid rather. But how did they respond to the opium epidemic? And throughout this book, you've got the Qing Empire that is trying to respond and control the trade of the substance. Throughout the various forms of the Chinese government, and they're trying to prohibit or control the flow of it so that it's not adversely impacting the population. One of the other factors, right, is that because of opium's mechanism of action, it's just like such a widely applicable substance. And so people are taking it like aspirin, basically.
It's like, I have a headache. I'm just going to smoke some opium.
well, and without an alternative, and you can kind of see how...
Diarrhea? Opium. It's like the Pepto-Bismol commercial up in here. Like upset stomach, diarrhea, heartburn, indigestion, opium.
Yeah, it's kind of a cure-all, right? And so...
it's not, by the way. Don't smoke opium for any other things.
in that era, right? Without the medicine and the people being worked and not being able to. There's no way for them to like have holistic continuum of care of health, right?
Yeah, they're probably like me. They don't even know what that means necessarily. They can't even define that. So if you want to read the book. Absolutely, do it. Come back. That's great. If you are probably 99% of the audience and don't want to read the book, let's kind of do a history of where we're at in this time period and kind of the facts on the ground. So we're in the 1600s. The Qing, for those of you who don't have a comprehensive knowledge of China, like I don't either, but I know what the timeline in the book says. And in the 1600s, the Qing dynasty takes over China. The Qing originally are from the Manchurian area, so like northwestern China, and they kind of sweep down. They take over by the like late 1600s, early 1700s. They pretty much have control of what we consider to be modern day China. Right about this same time, the Chinese there's records of the use of opium being smoked with tobacco as this kind of cure-all / recreational drug. The Qing go through a couple of empires, or emperors rather. They have some, they're making progress. There's major societal, as far as like hierarchy changes. There's a lot of technological advancement. And then after about 100 years or so, things are kind of slowly ticking downhill, like we see with, most capital G great empires in history. And make no mistake, the Qing dynasty is one of the most progressive society altering empires in Chinese history, like for both good and and bad. They're a very different type of dynasty. They have a very different type of structure than anything that the Chinese Empire has seen before. And they also are a societal class. Like ethnically, they're a very small portion of the population of the actual people that they rule over. Most of the population, like a vast majority, speaks Mandarin. And then you have like these like social elites that are of Manchu descent that are kind of the ruling class. And that means that societally, all those people that are part of these ruling families are kind of fast-tracked. And if you are not of Manchu descent, you spend your entire life anywhere from 30 to 60 to 90 years. I think there's a part in the book where they talk about like this 100-year-old just studying to take tests so that you can get to the next part, the next stage, so that you can study to take more tests. Right. And so there's also like some resentment going on, right, between one people group and another.
So I mean, culturally, in comparison, the British have this constitutional monarchy they've got, which is relatively fresh compared to imperialism. And the things that I see in the book where the British square off with the Qing dynasty is that the imperial systems that the faults that they have are faults in all imperial systems. I don't really see that as there was so much sort of from that era racism about the Chinese and really that associated the substance, what we would now call substance use disorder with like,
they associate it with this is just how the Chinese people are, is they all have this mental deficiency, like, which is a little hypocritical of the British because they also smoked opium widely until they're like, ooh, this is kind of a problem, we're going to curb this. But then also we're still going to just sell it to all of these colonial territories and spots that we do trade with because we can make a lot of money from it.
Right. And I don't know that it necessarily ever became as prevalent. And I think they had a bit more control over the importing. But yeah, you see that today, I think, with like where it's on one hand, it's a criminalized substance, but on the other hand, we have people in treatment programs taking it. It's like this duality, constantly with opium. And I think that's really profound, but we can come back to that in regards to the Manchu and all the political, strife between the cultures. And that's a reflection to me of the challenge with centralization of government to begin with, because, they're in that imperial system and then they've got to manage all these ethnic relations.
Interesting, Kurt. Cultural divides between people groups. It's almost like we're seeing the same thing in modern day.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's something you can completely ever escape from. But
interesting parallel. We might circle back to that later in this episode. So conversely, you were kind of talking about the British, right? This is the height of the British Empire. This is when you're playing Risk, the board game. This is the British Empire. They've just taken over a stranglehold of India. They've expanded to North America. The sun never sets on the British Empire. They're out there. They're doing the thing everywhere. Extremely powerful navy because the British Empire thrives on trade. So in the late 1700s, obviously the American Revolution happens. You've got the French Revolution happening. Because the American Revolution happens, or in part because the American Revolution happens, Britain is broke. They are often operating at a trade deficit, and they're looking to expand what they can sell and who they can sell to. They send an emissary to the Qing emperor. He gets drugged through the whole rigmarole. He finally gets to the capital, and he brings all this stuff. He has like telescopes and all this like fancy Western, the height of technology, and he's like, oh, once they see how great and smart we all are, that they'll know they have no choice but to trade with us. Meanwhile, the Chinese diplomats, which also there's a significant language barrier here.
Yeah.
They're trying to even figure out what each other want. Lost in translation, the Chinese are like, oh, they just want to like give us all this stuff. Like, well, this is stupid and useless, but I guess we'll take it. And he's like dragging a hot air balloon off the boat, and he's like, look at this amazing hot air balloon. Look at all this we can do. Why does this guy have a hot air balloon? Who cares about your stupid hot air balloon? We certainly don't. So, and also because of how the Qing culture works, they think that this British guy comes in and he's like, I come representing the great and mighty King George III and demand that your country opens up trade with us. And meanwhile, the Chinese are like, oh, they're bringing us all this stuff. It must be like a tribute. They want to just like, pay tribute to our emperor.
Only in the way that the British can do.
Yeah, right. So and when you talk about kind of the racism of the time, it does cut both ways. The Chinese think the British are just these swarmy, entitled morons that have all of this useless stuff that doesn't work, and they are very, especially at the top, and you can see this in how they write, and like this is kind of always been a part of Chinese culture, but you have the mandate of heaven, right? And the official writing
Celestial Empire.
Yes, it's all this very flowery celestial imperial stuff. And so in official communications between kind of these lieutenants and the emperor, it's all like, yes, great God King Emperor, I, your humble servant of the celestial bodies, does humbly bequeath you to prithee ask.
For the same reasons we had the American Revolution.
Well, but like it's not saying like, oh, the stupid Qing dynasty. Like they think they're all like so important. Like no, like the British thought exactly the same thing. They're like, yes, our Western medicine and technology is just so much superior to these savages, barbarians, and so you have two empires that both think that they are the top dog and everyone else is very silly and stupid and should just be giving them all the stuff.
There's that, yeah.
And in the ensuing years, I'm kind of yada-yadaing a lot of history, like 2 decades worth of history.
Right.
But it gets set up where the Chinese are like, oh my gosh, you want to trade with us so bad? Fine. You can trade with us. You can sell all this stuff. Here's this one port that you can do at it. You have to go through this port. You have to go through these people. And then you can sell us your stuff and we'll give you tea. Because the British
Canton,
people
right?
like, this is Canton. Because the British people like tea, obviously. I mean, insert British tea meme here.
Right.
And so the British are like, oh my gosh, like we're getting hooked on all this good Chinese tea. We're fiending for the tea, but that means that we're operating millions of pounds in the red. Over probably 3.5 decades of trade, the British are just bankrupting their country to get tea. The stuff that they're selling to China is not covering the sheer amount of tea that they are importing back throughout the empire, right?
Right.
So kind of fast.
Well, I think it was more things than that too. I think it was like silk and
I mean tea is kind of overgeneral as silk and porcelain.
That's a
stuff.
Caricature of British.
Well, that's okay. We can make fun of them.
Okay.
If you're British, email the show. Tell us how wrong we are. It's not my fault that that's what British people wanted to import in the 1800s. But yeah, and the Chinese kind of still have this same. They have this same opinion of British goods. So we're like, we don't need all your supposedly fancy crap. But what the Chinese do need is they need silver, because the Qing have this massive empire across thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of land. And they have to keep a very large standing army to kind of patrol all this area and stop the bandits and stop the rebellions.
Well, different armies of different ethnicities,
right,
and all these different variety of
it's a very
different kinds of soldiers. And,
it's a very ethnically diverse empire that the Qing have control of.
Right.
And so what they need is silver. They need silver to pay their stuff. So essentially what's happening is the British are giving them silver in exchange for tea and all these goods, and it's bankrupting the British. So the British are like, how can we stop this trade deficit from continuing to spiral out of control. And you have this lovely new piece of imperial territory in India, and India grows opium, like a lot of opium.
Maybe was it the Indians that introduced it to the Chinese in 1700? With maybe not the Turkish. Am I thinking too far north?
I think maybe it is.
Maybe
it
it's
is
the
coming
Indians.
through India, but
Yeah,
it's very slow. There's like some
Yeah.
mountains down there, so it's kind of like trickling in, but it's not mainstream.
I
It's
don't know
not
why
hip yet.
I thought the Turkish. I don't know why, but yeah, that sounds right.
It's not like the hip new thing,
Right.
Smoking opium,
Right.
But it's about to be because the British now control India, and they have this trade, and they're like, okay, well, if we can just sell opium, which is an addictive substance, we can kind of like make a lot of money off of this, and then we don't have to keep giving up all this silver. We can just get tea and all the fancy stuff, and just sell all this opium.
Right.
And at this point, the British, they had their own version of the opioid crisis, and they like put the kibosh on it. They strictly control imports, and they're not, allowing it to become like this mainstream thing. Whereas the Chinese, the Qing Empire is so vast and it's so disconnected. Like it takes months, and obviously in the British Empire too, that this becomes a problem during the war. Is it takes like 6 months for word to get back to Britain.
I was reading like they didn't have like an express delivery on the news from the front until like the war had already commenced, and it was like, wow, that's like so we didn't have Amazon Prime until
no. But even for the Qing, the empire, and Canton is so far south of the capital, like it takes 2 months for kind of things to go back and forth.
Right.
And so the British start exporting this opium from India to China, and this is where the opium epidemic in China really starts to kind of spiral out of control.
Well,
Like,
because
you
I think the merchants they recognize that this is like
This is a moneymaker.
This is a moneymaker. Yeah.
Oh yeah, kind of like the pharmaceutical companies back during the start of the opioid crisis, but we'll get into that. So the Qing Empire realizes this, and they're like, okay, no. We're losing. The British Empire used to be just feeding us silver and like money. We used to have this incredible, we had a sick gig. And now we're losing all this money
I thought
to
that
opium.
they said something like they went from having a 400 million bar surplus in circulation in their economy, a silver bar, to like negative 100 million or something in there.
Yeah.
I thought that was like, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head. Basically, they had less than, they were in a trade deficit at that point when they had.
I wish I remembered the number or had it marked, but it was something like
they're
that.
They're in a negative, what would that be, like a freaking negative 500% economy from where you were at? Like,
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, basically, I mean.
And it's a problem. That's a major problem. So slowly, because it takes 2 months for word to get from the capital down to Canton, the one port where the British are like doing this, they start to try to put restrictions. And there's a lot of really great characters in this book. I almost don't even want to get into a lot of them because it won't do justice to some of like the historical characters on both sides. And there's a lot of guys from the Qing dynasty and from the British that honestly are like just trying to do their job. Like Charles Eliot for the British, he's kind of the guy in charge of Canton, and he morally has this huge problem with the fact that opium is legal. But he also is like, well, like what the hell are we supposed to do? Like we need to sell something. Like this is what's greasing the wheels. We need to get these goods. So
that's sort of the irony
doing
with the missionaries too, spreading religion is like,
Oh,
on
yeah.
one hand they're trying to get Bibles into China, but on the other hand they're like
exporting opium.
They're traffickers of information, you know, but for the British war machine.
Right.
So I mean,
Yeah, the church doesn't come off looking too great historically in this as well.
Well,
and go figure.
I don't know if that's a reflection of those individual people, like you say, necessarily, as much as it's a reflection of this is why we don't want imperial clashes, because things get turned into like Excel spreadsheet
Yeah.
instead of talking about human beings. It becomes, what's the total on the opium exchange.
Right.
So, but I don't know if that was avoidable. The Chinese had been using opium and this is where it's like contentious, I think, for the Chinese history, because
the Chinese kind of make it seem like, oh, the British corrupted us and got the common people addicted to opium. But the Chinese were already smoking.
Yeah, they were
opium.
already.
It's not like the British never did either. But
right.
And
this is the nature of. This is why when I opened up with I had a book review on Facebook that I posted for it, and I said it's.
Do they still allow you to have a Facebook page?
We'll see for how much longer. But I was talking about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. They talk about that, and it's like, well, what's in Afghanistan? Well, opium is in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
When I think about empires, it's almost like that's the natural course of when you have that many people that one government is trying to centralize and rule over, and then you've got you've got a lot of power there, but there's a lot of displacement, right, where they're trying to pay all these armies and merchants are trying to make their money, and it's not something that's one-sided by any means, I think. Like
no, well, like all of history, the British weren't. It's not the British's fault necessarily that there was already a demand for opium.
Right.
Just like it's not the Chinese's fault that the British did their best to bully their way into the economy to open up trade and used gunboat diplomacy. Like neither side, and the book doesn't, favor one side or the other. Like neither side comes off looking great in this book as far as like.
Yeah, there's a lot of British citizens, or would you say subjects, because it's a monarchy?
Yeah, subjects at this point.
But, saying, this is the most immoral war of the history of wars, which is pretty, I mean, that's pretty profound how they felt about that. A lot of British people.
As individuals, a lot of the British are like, we are, how morally bankrupt are we for pushing this drug onto the Chinese citizens and in order to try to make more money for ourselves. And there's a lot of people in China that are Chinese subjects that are like, how are we allowing this to happen to ourselves? We're the ones that are creating the demand side of this equation. Right. We allowed this to happen to ourselves. But of course, the governments at the top, the Chinese are like, oh, it's all the British's fault. Right. This is if only Britain hadn't done this. And all the British are like, oh, well, the Chinese, they want the opium. I guess we're just going to give it to them and take all their money. Like,
well, and I think that eventually leads to, was it the Taiping Rebellion or the White Lotus?
Mm-hmm.
There was rebellions in response.
Mm-hmm.
There's rebellions in response to that imperial system and how frustrated they were. Because, from the imperial standpoint, they're sitting there doing executions on people that should have done their job better. But on the other hand, like people on the lower rungs can see that and they're going, oh my God, this is totally our government's fault.
The government's just hanging people for being addicted.
I think the people could see that not only are the people that are the opium dependents that were using it were getting persecuted for that, when in reality they might have just been using that because they're like cheap labor and they don't have any
bodies are
access
falling
to
apart,
medicine. Yeah,
and they need a painkiller.
And then on the other end, the people at the very top are getting blamed too. And I think as a Chinese citizens, they probably were watching that, just going, for what information they had access to.
Well, and also a lot of the government officials are still smoking opium,
right?
While they're like hanging people.
So it's like, how do you enforce that? And we see that not just through the Qing dynasty, but I believe at the end of the Qing dynasty, in there it talks about how the Qing sort of starts to dissolve, and then the nationalists and Republicans kind of try to take power, but they're trying to reform China at a time where the country's bankrupt. They have to worry about Japan that's pushing on the empire.
Yep.
And the idea of sort of an Asian alliance is kind of a pipe dream It's like, it's just not going to happen. So when I was reading this, I was like, on one hand, I understand why our politics internationally and globally today are the way they are. And I have a lot of sympathy for the Chinese because, during that period, let me say that, the European powers and the United States were engaged with World War I they were in the buildup towards that in that era. So I don't know that they could have they were in a position to really be sympathetic towards China. Because I know that they tried to, the Republican or Nationalist Party tried to garnish support overseas. And they had one of the guys in there that was one of the early founders for it, was going internationally, was trying to go to different places and garnish support. I forget what his name was, but in the meantime, they are trying to prohibit opioid use or opium use, but admittedly, there's no money. So
what? How are you?
How else do you garnish taxes for the standing government that does exist? Right. And this is where then you start to see strife between the Republicans and the nationalists, and then the communists, which were being bankrolled by the USSR. And all the while, everybody's...
And also we're selling opium. Everyone was selling opium.
Right. All the while, everybody's trying to prohibit opium at the same time they're collecting tax on it. And I find that terribly tragic. And in the United States right now, I don't see... That's worrisome because... I don't see how empires don't head down this trajectory once you get a massive collective of people using opium or opioids.
Interesting.
And that's why I read the book, right?
Repeating itself or rhyming.
That's why I read the book, right? Because you got into more of the fine details of the events, and there's a lot of great detail in this too. And I'm almost oversimplifying all of the events, but it's just profound how much opium was at the center of every ideological movement, whether for good or for bad. Yeah. Whether people were blaming it or whether they were like, we should just legalize it, which I think a lot of those political movements had to get to a point where they couldn't prohibit it too hard because then they were in fear of a rebellion that would overthrow their legitimacy. And it just makes you really sympathetic towards Chinese people. But the tragedy is that when the communists took over, from Julia Lovell's history and the standpoint of the book, it looks like they really used violence and they used, again, opium sales to get into a position of power. Yeah. And I almost see that level of authoritarianism as it's a tragic, almost natural course, almost is how I see that, to what had been different forms of government trying to create policy around opium use for 100 years. Right. Prior to the communists stepping in and being supported by foreign government, the Russian USSR, right? And
yeah, the book and the book goes into a lot of like you said, it goes into a lot of details about like the actual battles and the nitty gritty and all of that, which I don't think is the most important lesson that you can glean from the book. Just kind of glossing it over. Essentially, the Chinese finally there's a government official sent down to clean up the opium. They seize all the opium, burn it. British Empire, not happy about that. So they use that as an excuse to go to war. The Chinese go through a series of government directors that get assigned by the empire to go down, and they go down there. The British send kind of an expeditionary force from India. This, not necessarily important, just a detail that I like. They set up the Chinese general sets up all these forts, the forts of eternal peace, consolidated security, one's named of suppressing, of overawing and quelling those from afar. And they like build up all these forts, but they don't design them well. They don't design them with any sort of quality. Right. And the British just kind of roll down in their ironclad ship, and then all their other gigantic British gunboats and just blow them all up in like 2 seconds.
Well, and that's the tragedy of theological and imperialism, or
Right.
theological militarism and imperialism.
And in the meantime, the government official is sending these dispatches back to the emperor like, yes, the British, we killed 10,000 British sailors and everything is going great. And then the emperor is just like, oh, so glad to hear it. 3 months later, he finds out that actually the Chinese have lost like 4 cities in the south. And he's like, I'm going to send someone else down there. And then the next person does the exact same thing.
Well, and because they were so afraid of the imperial system and not being effective. And I think there's a certain amount of, we're trying to, they were at odds with that technology, right? I mean, there wasn't a precedent for that kind of engagement in empire that was kind of set in feudalism and that didn't have the kind of colonial technology that the British had, right?
Right. I mean, they're still using bows and arrows,
right?
And they have cannons, but they're not as advanced. They have
the mentality is more of a quantity, over quality, because they have so many different subjects to rule over, and they've got all these different groups, and so the modularity of the technology is more important, really, than the special. I think that's the really specialization, but also that China had been in feudal wars leading up to the Qing dynasty, to even have a chance to develop technology like that. I don't know, because it would have been constant ground combat. So, I mean, of course, by the time the British come in and they have naval dominance and they're unable to control the port and the water, and it's
so the British, they take over a bunch of different cities. They use that as leverage. They it takes forever, but eventually they cut a deal to where they get more ports opened up. And about 20 years later, they don't like that deal. So they go, the Chinese are talking about banning opium again. And so they find another excuse. And the second Opium War, they have even less of like a reasonable provocation to go to war. But monetarily, again, follow the money. Like monetarily, they needed to be able to go to war to bankroll all these operations that they have going on. So they find a reason, they go to war again. The same thing kind of happens, that to overgeneralize a lot, the British kind of go up the coast. They set up in defensive formations on land with their Marines. Their ships kind of obliterate everything from afar. Yeah. And then their soldiers just kind of sit there with cannons and muskets and just obliterate these Chinese troops whose leadership, like from the top down, like you can kind of see this is right towards the end of the Qing dynasty, right? This is in part what leads to their downfall. And you can see their society crumbling. Like the people that are at the top have been put there in their positions essentially because of family status rather than actual qualifications. And so from the bottom up, the troops have no confidence in their leaders. Which means that when things start going south, there's really no rallying back and trying to save situations. It just ends up in routes pretty much every time.
Right. They're in, a cultural defeat as well as a military, defeat.
Right.
Yeah. And that disconnect in that old imperialistic system, which is why and the British saw that too. That's why they had so much questioning about, wow, is this really ethical? Because of the Chinese military losses, it's like clearly they have the superior technology.
Yeah, the British's casualties are in like the hundreds, and the Chinese have casualties in the tens of thousands.
Yeah. So that was another tragic aspect, not just the fact that the opium had really financially bankrupted, and I almost see it as, it reminds me of when I learned about Berlin during the 1930s, the Treaty of Versailles, and how bankrupt the German people were. There's no doubt there was like prostitution running rampant, and they couldn't really hold their culture together. Of course, by the time the Second War rolled around, it was just pretty much verified kind of what the trajectory of the war, the First War. So,
Well, that's a recap of the history, kind of as we know it, with the British after the Second Opium War essentially getting their unregulated trade of opium into the country, and that leads to everything that you were talking about, where the nationalists supplant the Qing Empire, the Qing dynasty falls. And then after that, with the outbreak of World War II and imperialistic Japan, the Chinese Communist Revolution springs up, and again, that will eventually lead to...
You mean World War I? Because that was prior to World War II.
Well, in the 1930s.
Oh,
so
1930s.
the Japanese
You're
invasion
thinking
of
like-
Manchuria. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Prior
Gotcha.
technically to what we from a Western perspective would consider the start of World War II.
Yeah.
And then again, like you said, in every one of those cases, those leadership groups are using the sale of opium to kind of bankroll their operations. So I think next episode we're going to really get into the what does this mean segment of the narrative, what that meant for the Chinese culture at the time, and what it means for us now as we go through a very similar kind of
Well, I would say cultural decline. Maybe
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's too conservative, but yeah, I would say that opioids have had a huge impact on the United States. I mean,
yeah, understatement. Okay, well then until next time, I'm Isaac Smolden.
Kurt
Honak, Isaac Smolden, Diagnonsense. Tune in next time for the exciting conclusion to our 4-hour-long podcast on the Opium Wars.